Before we have the discussion, I'm going to invite my fabulous two panelists to join us on stage. So we have Rick Appleby, who is the Head of Digital Compliance and Conduct at NatWest Group, and also Alex Gerald, VP of Regulatory Strategy at BNY Mellon. Welcome. If you give them a round of applause, that would be fantastic.
Thank you. I think I need to update my LinkedIn profile photo because I definitely don't have that much hair anymore and haven't for some time, actually.
I mentioned that I've been working in this space for a really long time, and I think one of the things that's most interesting about regulatory change is we call it regulatory change, but actually it's a continuous problem. It's no longer just something that happens once in a blue moon. It's continuous across many different areas of a financial organisation. It's also a very, very difficult problem to solve, how you feed that change all the way through your business to make sure that you are compliant and actually understand what it is that the regulators are asking of you. But finally, I think there is some real opportunity out there and some really innovative solutions to help solve that problem, which we all know is very difficult. No one's really tackled it, as far as I'm aware, to the point where it's no longer something that they need to think about. So I'm really delighted to be able to talk about this today with such an illustrious panel, but also two people who I know are still dealing with the pain of this on a daily basis. So let's get into it. So one of the things that I think is the holy grail of reg change management is this idea of the straight through processing of regulation, from regulation to your policies to your controls to evidencing that traceability all the way back through to the regulators. So my first question to you, Rick, is how are you seeing this in your organisation? Is it something that you've nailed, or where are you on that journey?
Yeah, it's all done. We've sorted it. Yeah, I mean, exactly as you say, Sian. And I think that's the point, isn't it? This is regulatory change management. The majority of the time, it's not the implementation of something that's completely brand new and we've never seen before. So you then go back to the point of, well, what's our understanding of the current regulatory landscape and how we currently comply? And I think that's often where the challenge starts, because you need to understand that and where you are in order to understand what's changing and what you need to change. And I think frequently we just as an industry haven't been fantastically good at that. I mean, we've probably all talked about reg mapping and rules mapping and that sort of thing, which has often been done on spreadsheets that sit in a drawer somewhere and we don't look at again until we really need to, and by that time they're out of date. So I think that idea of linking regulatory obligations or requirements, once again, through to our policy architecture, which is often how organisations choose to interpret the regulatory requirements, through to our control environment, and then how do you plug in what's changing in the regulatory landscape, that kind of horizon scanning part, into your current understanding. And it sounds really simple, right? Because we have conversations about it all the time. Oh, we just need to link these two together. But actually, it's fiendishly difficult.
Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we are working very hard on, and I think we're very nearly there, is fully integrating our reg change management systems and tool sets with the rest of the risk and controls processes and frameworks. And without that, documenting a reg change based on a spreadsheet, be it within a dedicated tool set, becomes a very simple fire and forget cost of doing business. And without integrating it into the rest of the bank's frameworks, you don't see the benefits of being able to view in real time your regulatory risks, your footprints, and where the impacts of reg change are likely to be seen.
Yeah, and of course the regulators don't make it easy for us. They don't produce their regulations in a standard format in language that is easy to understand. So that's one of the first challenges and hurdles to get over. Apologies if there are any regulators in the room, but we would really love you to write your regulation in a little bit more of a straightforward way that would help us to comply. So one of the things about compliance is the cost of compliance and how that cost of compliance is actually impacting the regulatory change management space. Is this having an impact on your organisation, Alex?
So I think I saw back in February there was a report from LexisNexis saying the cost of compliance for North American headquartered banks have gone up by 98%. I wish I knew how they got to that number. Like it's unquantifiable. We've tried a number of ways just to secure funding. In order to secure funding, you have to say how much this is costing the bank. It can't do it. It's a huge challenge. Where we do see, the businesses see the costs is during reg change, and not necessarily becoming compliant. We know we have to do that, but actually documenting it in a proper tool set is seen as something that happens at the end of the program, end of the project, end of the implementation. It takes time. It can be painful. And they want to fire and forget it. They're bored of the governance by that stage. But actually, the key to doing that and helping the business maintain their data sets is making it simple, making sure you've got a good UI which they can actually use, which makes the system work for them.
Rick, cost of compliance.
Cost of compliance. Yeah, like Alex, I'd love to know how one quantifies this, and also, what does cost of compliance mean? Where does compliance overlap with just doing the right thing for your customers, and you've got changing expectations in the market versus in evolving expectations from a regulator perspective, and then you've got how businesses are sometimes inefficient at doing that versus the people who sit in risk and compliance who are dealing with sometimes antiquated systems and a lack of data. So, yeah, it's cost of compliance is one of those things which is always a challenge. But like Alex was saying, I think there's value in compliance and the data, which we haven't always been that great at being able to unlock for the business, particularly when you think about how many customer-led changes the organisation's looking to put live, better products, better journeys, and that sort of thing. And actually, how much of the friction that's in getting those things to market is because of a lack of clear understanding internally over what the expectations from a risk perspective are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that overlap between regulation and risk is becoming closer and closer. And I think that means that actually compliance is also deeply embedded, has to be deeply embedded in your risk management, and trying to separate the two. What's my cost of risk management versus my cost of compliance actually no longer really makes sense. One of the things that I found in my research as well is that the regulators move the goalposts a lot and don't give us time to catch up with that. I was talking to someone earlier who's talking about an FRTB. If you don't know what that means, it's fundamental review of the trading book. The rules around how you calculate market risk for capital adequacy processes are changing. But we've known they've been changing since about 2010. But because the goalposts shift, we don't know what the final rules are going to be, particularly in the UK. The cost of just getting to this point, let alone the full implementation, must be huge. And some of that cost is because of the regulatory process rather than financial institutions being lax in terms of achieving those deadlines. So it's a really hard thing, I think, to navigate. But if we can't calculate the cost of compliance, it also makes it hard to build a business case for the kind of tooling that you need. Is that ability to convince the executive in your company something that gets in the way in terms of your regulatory change management process?
It certainly means you have to focus on the benefits.
Yes.
So the easy sell is obviously accountability, particularly where there are existing accountability regimes. The executives know they have to do it, and they want to do it well just because they've got skin in the game, as their name on the hook. There are other benefits as well. We want to be able to streamline our compliance processes, and if we record everything in an easy-to-use format and easy-to-understand data, then we can reuse that when we want to launch new products, make more business change, and that really sells itself to the business. And thirdly, if everything is there in a single contiguous data set, then we can report on it in near real time, and you can see your regulatory risks and your footprint. You can use that to identify challenges, help with root cause analysis when there, obviously we hope there aren't, but if there are problems.
So obviously, getting funding for doing your job well is with technology is one issue. Are there any other obstacles that you have, Rick, in terms of your regulatory change management and doing it effectively?
Well, I think, going back to some of the stuff that we talked about, and I think consumer duty is an interesting example. Actually, I joined NatWest at the end of a lot of the work that we were doing, but I've seen it across a number of organisations. I think not knowing where you are today makes it a lot harder to know where you need to be going forward. And so, we've the three of us have talked a lot about this, and I know there's a number of providers here today who are trying to solve this problem, and there's some really interesting solutions here. But there are a whole, particularly if you're an organisation that has a footprint outside of a single country, there's an enormous amount of regulation that you need to understand, and it's to be fair to the regulators, it's often written in such a way as to take into account a very diverse organisation, so it has to be relatively all-encompassing, but that does make it quite challenging to understand if you're an organisation. So then you're in a situation of, well, we've got 500,000 rules here. Well, some of them aren't even really rules, they're just positioning and guidance and that sort of thing, and some of them don't apply to us because we don't undertake that activity. And then even the ones that we know do apply to us and do create an obligation, well, what do they actually mean in terms of our organisation, and what do we do? And then which parts of the organisations they apply to, and what do we do to ensure that we're compliant? And that's your foundational point in terms of dealing with reg change. If you haven't got that, if you're then having to deal with a huge piece of reg change, you're then having to have a lot of people sitting in a room filling out spreadsheets as to what do we do now. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of organisations have seen over some of these bigger pieces, and consumer duty is an interesting example of that.
Yeah, and I guess if you do have a global footprint and you're operating in the US versus Europe and the EU, the regulatory frameworks themselves are very different. EU, UK, much more principles-based. US, very legalistic and prescriptive. So that issue of interpretation is multiplied and made more difficult with that lack of comparability, I guess, across the jurisdictions.
And difficult within an organisation who's trying to grapple with this, because you've got different cultures across those different parts of the organisation.
Yeah.
And that's before we get to APAC.
Oh yes, I didn't throw them into the mix, but yeah. What additional challenges do you find from that region?
From a toolset and data perspective, a key challenge is language.
Yeah.
It's not just non-English language, it's non-Cyrillic text, not Cyrillic, Latin text. Life has got a lot better with the advent of AI and translation. Previously, we were having to go to external counsel for legal translations. These days, don't tell legal. But the output that you get from I don't want to say Google, but translation services like that, for a first pass identification of where your pinch points might be, is excellent.
So we've talked about some challenges. Building the business case, demonstrating the benefits, the issue of understanding actually what it is you need to comply with in the first place and what you need to do. Are there any other key obstacles that you'd like to call out in terms of effective regulatory change management?
Well, and I think you touched on it as well, Alex. The UI of a lot of platforms that we're using to try and automate this is not as great as it could be, and I think that's that there's a number of reasons why that may be. I think if you think about where a lot of some of this stuff started, things like trying to implement MiFID 2, for example, a lot of people started on spreadsheets and thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had a better way of doing this? And it kind of evolved from then. But the other part is a lot of these maybe more legacy products have been built for and including a risk and compliance function. And with the greatest respect to all of those people, I am one of them, UI and UX is not necessarily the first thing that you think about. You think about functional requirements, but then you put it in the hands of somebody in the organisation, in the business, who needs to then use it, and you're in a position where you need a couple of 100 pages of user manuals to deal with that, and you're failing there, frankly. And so I think, although if the more we can start to think about these things as real products for the whole organisation to use and apply some of those principles and just upgrade our own expectations of them, the more people are going to use them, the better quality the data is going to be, and then you can really start to unlock value.
So we decided to build in-house. We looked at a number of vendors, and there are some excellent vendor solutions out there, but actually trying to find the correct components to fit into the end-to-end architecture that had a global coverage was a challenge, so we built in-house. We designed the system, we designed the framework, we set up the business requirements for the tooling, and then I went on parental leave for 4 months. And I came back to find that the rest of it had been designed by committee with one or two very questionable design decisions built into it. So the ability to please stakeholders without actually being driven entirely by them and land on a common framework which works for everybody is crucial.
That's really it, and it's really hard to achieve because, other people in the organisation are rightly focused on other tasks, so they need to have that real clear understanding straight away rather than having to drill down through several steps or go via a policy to a risk to a control to back to the regulation. It's complex. And I think you've segued us very nicely into the next question, which is actually about some of the opportunities for technology to help with this. I mean, we know there's some fantastic vendors out there, and anyone who's not familiar with the regulatory change management space in terms of the vendors who are out there, it's a really hot and exciting space at the moment. There's a lot of mergers and acquisitions activity happening. One of the vendors here and on the board behind me announced a very big acquisition just today. So it's a really hot space, and I think that's speaking to the difficulty of the problem, but also perhaps to the fact that technology hasn't yet quite got there in solving that end-to-end problem. So from your perspective, Alex, you've obviously built your own technology to do this. Is that because you're not seeing what you need on the market? Is it because you needed something that's very idiosyncratic for your organisation? Is it a combination of the two?
Part of it was a cost issue, and it just became easier to build it in-house. Part of it is the ability to integrate it with various other platforms. I think rather than outsourcing and relying on other people to do work and integrate with other outsourced platforms, it became easier to just do it internally. Just going back to outsourcing, one of the issues that we had was having ended various vendor relationships. Retaining access to the data was problematic and challenging. We've got entire copies of data sets that have been given to us by vendors post-agreement, but actually without the correct queries, without the correct databases, structures, it's very difficult to get that, and that's a big lesson that we've learned. Ideally, there would be a vendor out there, and I think the vendors are absolutely getting there, which has an end-to-end process which works at a global level. But it wasn't there at that particular time. The other challenge that, of course, particularly large organizations like us has, is vendor agreements. We have terms of contract which stipulate that you can only terminate contracts at set times, and just trying to build that into a multi-year cycle is challenging. Yeah,
really hard. You're nodding a lot, Rick. Does all that sound very familiar?
Yeah, definitely. I was just thinking while Alex was talking there, because there doesn't seem to be a standardised way of doing this in the market, and I kind of feel like it would be great if, like Apple did about sort of 15, 20 years ago, and basically said, this is what a phone looks like now. And everyone said, yep, that's about right. It would be great if someone could do that, because otherwise I think we're all wasting time and development energy in trying to work out the best way to do it, when actually there probably just is a way. And if everyone could just say, do you know what, from understanding the regs in the landscape through to understanding which ones apply to you, through to understanding what they mean, who they apply to, and then through to logging kind of what you do to comply, linking that in with your policy architecture, and then monitoring what's happening from a reg change perspective. If someone could just say, this is how we do it now, I think that would be really helpful, because otherwise a lot of organisations are trying to work out how to do that.
And for not much money.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Very
I think
true.
that goes back to part of what you were talking about how do you build the business case and that sort of thing. And I think a lot of that is the value in doing this well is in the organisation not having to spend loads of time doing stuff that it was otherwise doing, and that includes getting products to market faster. That includes, dealing with regulatory change quicker and easier because we have a better understanding of where we are.
One of the things that strikes me as well, I mean, if we think about regulation and what it is, it's ultimately a lot of it is a problem about language and data. So do you see there's a role here for some of the newer technologies like generative AI to help solve this problem? Is that something you're looking at, Alex, or is that you're not quite there yet?
We found last year when we were looking at vendors to help us with this, a lot of them simply wanted to sell obligation extraction, automated obligation extraction. But actually, given that we found that one regulatory requirement could be interpreted very differently by a large number of our businesses, actually the automated extraction didn't particularly work for us. That said, there have been huge strides in the way generative AI and predictive AI has approached the problem in the last year, and we're getting there. The legal firms, particularly the Magic Circle firms, are making huge strides in this area. But the crucial point to understand it's not a golden bullet. It still requires a very technical person and skilled person in order to ask the right questions and get the correct output. For a lay person, you will ask the wrong question and you won't understand how it got to the answer, and that's not a good place to be in.
I think that's absolutely right. And, all the time you are doing any interpretation or extracting any particular requirements, whatever, that there is some degree of risk in that because you could get it wrong, or at least your interpretation, your understanding of what it means may differ to that of the regulator. So I think you always, at least for a good period of time, you will need a human in the loop. So I think it's then about what can the technology, what can artificial intelligence, as an example, do to get you one or two steps ahead. So at the moment, we do a lot of this idea of bucketing regulations up into what we call themes and then looking for logical combinations of the regulations in there with a view to translating them into something that is more understandable to the people in the organisation. We refer to it as obligations a lot of the time. That's not without risk, and therefore you need good people to do it, but you also need somebody accountable for if we get it wrong. And the key for us is how can we use technology to shorten that time span to just make it more efficient. But I don't think we're in a position for some time to take a person out of that loop.
I mean, interpretation was one of the things that came out time and time again in my research, and how it would be so much easier if you could just ring a regulator, ring the policy team and say, is this what you mean by this? It's never going to happen, by the way, unfortunately. And I think part of that is because they deliberately want you to have to think about what it means for your organisation, what it means to you, and being able to actually defend that interpretation back to the regulator. And think as long as you do that, you'll be okay. Do you think there's any room for some kind of consensus around what regulatory obligations mean, or do you think it has to be particular to firms?
I don't think you're going to get away from it being particular to firms, and not just firms, but individual lines of business or branches within firms.
I agree, and I think even if you got to a position where firms, you had a sufficient number of firms who agreed that a certain interpretation was what they thought it was, that provides some degree of cover, if you like. But all the time you're dealing with words, even if you kind of define and define and define, there's still room for interpretation in those words, so you're still going to get divergence.
Yeah. This is why it's an interesting problem, and I've spent 22 years of my life thinking about it.
Just that? Have you thought about anything else during that 20
No, I'm very fun at parties, I promise. So thinking about regulatory change more broadly, how do you think organisations can better measure and assess the impact of reg change on their building? I mean, we've talked a lot about how you're doing that, how you're thinking about it, but what would be the next step you would like to take in improving that even further? Rick?
I think, so one thing that I'm really interested in looking at the moment, and what I think I've seen across a lot of organisations in terms of dealing with reg change and what regulators are talking about is we often think about it as kind of a workflow. So, regulators will produce a lot of output, right, including speeches and enforcement actions and fines and then consultations and all of that sort of thing. And as soon as you are regulated by more than one regulator, well, that number's doubling, tripling, and that sort of thing. And so then you're potentially in a situation where if you treat each of those as an alert, well, maybe you've got 1,000, several thousand coming into your organisation each month. And then if you're treating that as a workflow, well, each of those needs to go to somebody and they need to do something. And there is a limit to how many of those you can look at. So you tend to look at the really, really important ones, the ones that are going to have the biggest change. But the question is, what information are we not looking at that's contained within the other things? And how useful might that be? And that's an area that really interests me at the moment as to how can we treat that kind of output from regulators more like a really interesting data source that we can run queries on, and we can look for themes and trends, and also then start to potentially build predictive capability. Could you run any sort of regression testing on things like consumer duty, where you can start to see, regulators started to change their sentiment and their language at this point, and we start to see a cluster of activity through to we started to see a degree of enforcement here, and then, well, we started to get a clear sense that there was some change coming in here. And if you could start to build a model around that, could you then apply it, regression test it over different topics, and could you get to a point where you start to see, we're seeing this activity, and when we see this activity, this means we are X% confident that we are 9 to 12 months away from this, and when we see this, we're X% confident that we're 2 to 4 years away from a big pace of reg change. I don't know, maybe crazy, but just interesting.
No, it sounds very cool.
Doesn't it?
I mean, I think it's a good point, because we know when change is coming. I mentioned the FRTB example earlier. We know change is coming quite a long way in advance, but I think there's a tendency in organisations to wait until maybe a year before that implementation deadline, and then scrabble around, try to get funding, try to get technology in. You do everything in a tactical way, and then you never have time to make it more strategic. And so that's when you end up with these issues of legacy infrastructure, and then difficulty when those rules change again. Well, how do we do it the first time? We don't know. We were running so hard just to meet the deadline that we cut some corners, not cut corners in terms of compliance. Just put that out there, and never would do that.
Good clarification there.
But maybe some workarounds. Let's put it that way. And so it becomes very hard. And that idea of kind of predictive compliance is very enticing. Alex, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think I'm far more simplistic. The regulations very rarely lead the market. They're put in place after the fact, after development, in order to protect the consumer. And think about outsourcing. Outsourcing was there and existed well before outsourcing regulations. If we had built good outsourcing frameworks internally, then actually the cost of changing things in order to comply with the new regulation would be minimal. So the focus should probably be on us as banks and institutions having good best practice frameworks, processes and controls in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think that convergence between compliance and risk management hopefully should happen.
And I understand there's a cost of doing that,
Yeah.
but
There's also an interesting point around how things become obvious in hindsight, but at the time were completely fine. I had the delight of dealing with PPI complaints across a number of organisations, and what was seen as terrible during that time was really good business practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, several years earlier, and so, you know, part of this is about changing expectations, and I'm not seeking to say that what people did with PPI was good in any way, because it clearly wasn't. But equally, it was what a lot of people did, right?
Yeah. We've got some time for some questions. I've already got a couple in on the app, but please do either submit questions via Barella, or we have people in the room. And my friend Dan is at the front.
Do you think regulation's becoming too political, starting with Coots and Farage and now the name and shame? Is this just a temporary thing? But I'm quite concerned that they're losing any sort of independence to really take on the bad stuff.
That's a really good question, very, very topical. I'll hand it over to the panellists. I've got some thoughts as well, Dan. Is regulation becoming too political?
I don't know. I'm not sure I'm necessarily seeing it becoming political in particular. I think the majority of the time regulation seeks to just make sure that the end consumer is in a position that is fair and reasonable. And you know, I also think as technology changes, a lot of regulation is attempting to deal with some of the consequences of that change. So yeah, that would be my take on that.
Alex, is there something you want to comment on? I know it's slightly difficult for people from financial institutions to comment on issues of politics, but...
No, I think I'll just go back to the earlier comment about regulation trying to protect consumers. I don't think that is generally a political issue. Mostly common sense.
I'm going to be the controversial one on the panel, actually, in answering this question. I think regulation is inherently political. Regulations are there to implement laws that are set by the legislature, effectively. I think where politics perhaps shouldn't play a role is how regulators then enforce those regulations. I think regulators should be able to be independent of that kind of political interference. Though historically, I don't think they ever really have been. If you think about, if you're old enough, if you think about the pre-global crisis days, everything was about light touch regulation. And I think if you look in the archives, there are even some letters between the FSA and the cabinet at the time saying that they were interfering too much in how the FCA or FSA should regulate. And I think following the global financial crisis, the pendulum swung back the other way. And I think now we're seeing it again go back to this kind of lighter touch. You know, firms shouldn't be named and shamed in investigations. And so I think it's inherently political, but it shouldn't be political around the way that firm enforcement is happening. I hope that was a decent answer to your question. And I respect the fact that my panellists weren't perhaps able to share their personal views. Are there any other questions in the room?
Thank you. Thanks, Sian. So you've already mentioned very briefly about a need for more standardized ways of writing regulations and help with interpretation of those regulations. I'm interested to know to what extent the panel might think that digital rules, digital handbooks might help them in their efforts to comply more automatically.
It's fundamental.
Yeah.
Do you want to expand on that? Because we were talking about this earlier, weren't we?
The challenge that we have is actually, there's a huge pressure on us from a regulatory perspective, but also from a common sense perspective, to have digitized end-to-end workflows. All of our data is digital these days. And we're in a position where the lawmaking bodies, the rulemaking bodies issue PDFs, which becomes very laborious to copy and paste or indeed semi-automatedly extract into our tool sets. It's done in non-standardized formats. We have the scope for errors to creep in, or we pay vast sums of money to many of our good friends sitting out there. And actually, we would all save a lot of money if the regulators, if the legislative bodies issued their regulations in a digital format in the first place.
And that's all of them, not just some of them.
All of them.
Rick?
Yeah, what he said. I mean, yeah, absolutely. There are technology solutions out there that enable us to deal with that challenge, but actually, is it a challenge we should have to deal with? Is that where we're best placed to put on money?
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be anything difficult, even just an Excel file.
Yeah. There you go. Any other questions in the room? I have one that's come through on the app. So what do you identify as the biggest global trends that will play a key part in implementing effective regulatory change management?
Global trends that will play a key part in implementing effective regulatory change. So I guess if we're talking about things that will make it easier, then
I
hope so. Yeah. I think it's what we were talking about in the session before, right? Which is how can we use things like AI to help us better understand what requirements are, extract those obligations, and then also run that over our existing understanding of the organisation through control libraries and policy frameworks and that sort of thing, and join all of that data up, because theoretically the majority of our policies should be informed by regulation. So having a direct lineage through to that, well, that can probably help us simplify our policy architecture as well. But and then how do you understand what that reg change is impacting? Once again, it sounds so simple, but actually it's really hard. And the more technology can help us to improve that, just the easier this is going to be, and the greater value we can drive through the organisation.
Alex, same question.
I think that's a stock answer.
Okay.
I have nothing to add on that. Sorry.
So what he said.
Yeah.
I think one thing that is another ongoing trend in regulatory change management is this global convergence and then divergence as things change geopolitically as well. And I think if I was in your role, I'd be like, well, I would like to see there be a trend to more convergence, a little bit like we had after the global financial crisis. But now the EU and the UK are moving further apart. I'm not going to say the B word. And the US and the EU, and then you have APAC in the mix. That convergence would be very welcome, I imagine, for everyone who's having to deal with this problem on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and there's a risk inherent in that as well. It's not just the EU and the UK and the US pulling further apart. Yeah. Actually, the world is becoming more polar or bipolar, particularly with crises over in the Ukraine and Russia and China asserting themselves.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, in many ways, convergence and a common approach makes things easier. If I was playing a devil's advocate for a moment though, I would also say diversity of opinion and how to do things and what the right thing isn't a bad thing, because sometimes if you end up going down that kind of almost groupthink path, you do potentially miss things that then come up later.
Yeah, that's it. That's a very good point. Are there any other questions in the room? There's a mic coming. There we go.
Can I ask who in your organisation is responsible for overseeing reg change, or does it vary depending on the risk type?
I think, I mean, in terms of providing oversight in a traditional form, that's probably the second line of defence, depending on the type of regulation that we're talking about. So you've got a number of different risk types, and there'll be a second line of defence function there for most of them. But I think that's different for who's doing it and who's owning it and who's actually accountable for it, which obviously has to be the organisation, the accountable executives within the organisation, and then the first line teams who are kind of implementing that. I think they need to have some form of oversight themselves to make sure that that's being done well in quantity assurance. So I think apologies for me, I think it's a bit of a nuanced answer, basically depending on what type of reg change we're talking and what we mean by oversight, if you like.
I think the onus within our institution is definitely on the first line overseeing their change effectively. There is obviously a huge role for the second line and the third line. And in an ideal scenario, there'll be a centralized first line function which provides that oversight to ensure consistency across the enterprise.
Great. So we're nearly out of time, but this has been a fascinating discussion from my perspective. It's always good to hear new and additional things about this very difficult problem. But also, I think there's some hope that you're beginning to get to grips with it and to tackle it. And we know there's a lot of work going on in terms of innovation and technology to try and tackle this issue of regulatory change.